Okay, as promised, this next video deals specifically with this concept of the three basic language functions. Now, you'll recall I've mentioned in previous lessons that a German language theorist from the late 19th century, early 20th century named Karl Bülher isolated language functions into these three basic types. Now, we could probably identify many more, but he would say that they all pertain or could be categorized under these three labels. So the first one is the expressive function, right? That's when the language is being used in order to express experiences, convey emotions, or attitudes. So the author is expressing something. The second function is the informative. That is when the language is being used, because remember, these are language or linguistic functions. So the language is being used to provide information, to present facts. And then the third and final language function is when the language is being used to influence the reader, to make requests. So you might call this the appellative or even the persuasive function. Another slide, similar information, just presented in a slightly different way. Again, Bülher holds that all language use, every use of language, whether written or oral, reflects three basic language functions. The expressive, which we could also call the artistic, to express emotions, values, attitudes. The informative, or we could call it the representational, which is to convey facts or information. And then the vocative or persuasive. The purpose of that language use or language function is to elicit a reaction or response from the reader. Now, if you think about it, each of these language functions, the three language functions, you could map them onto the three main players in our communication model, right? The author, the message, and the reader. The expressive function is concerned with the intention of the author, his or her expression of ideas, emotions, experiences. The informative language function you could map onto the function of the message in a text, the content, the text's informational content. And then the vocative language function, right, when we're using language to elicit a response from a reader, that obviously correlates to the reader. So these three language functions, they correlate to the three players or actors in the model of textual communication. So what happens is, usually when you're looking at a text, whether it's a warning sign or a book of poetry like this one by Pablo Neruda, or a balance sheet, right? Usually one of the language functions, basic language functions, will be dominant, but oftentimes text will combine more than one function, perhaps all three. So these are examples. Let's take a look at these basic language functions and see how they might apply to these particular text types or genres. On the left, we have a warning sign, right? Is the language function here the primary or dominant language function, vocative, informative, or expressive? Let's think about it for just a second. If we say it's vocative, then we're saying the primary purpose of the language, of this language use in this document, moving gait, keep clear, do not let children, right? You must use a separate entrance if you're a pedestrian. If we were to say that the primary language function is vocative, we would be saying that it's trying to affect the reader's behavior, and in fact it is. So in this particular case, the primary language function is vocative. What about a book of poetry, like the middle image here, right? 20 poemas de amor y una canción desesperada, right? A very famous volume of poetry by the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. What do you think is the primary or dominant language function? Which one did we say we could also call artistic or creative? Expressive, because in that language function, the author is expressing his or her emotions, ideas, okay, and experiences. So typical of literature, poetry, novels, dramatic texts, essays even, okay, although an essay might also have a strong vocative or persuasive component as well. And then finally, if we look on the right, this image on the right, what this is this sort of a simplified earnings report or the balance sheet section of a corporate earnings report. Here, the primary language function is to provide information. So we would say it's informative. Although in a broader earnings report issued to shareholders, there's probably a secondary vocative, right? There's an attempt also to influence the reader's behavior. So we can see that in each text type, one of these language functions identified by Bülher is going to be dominant, but we might have more than one that apply. Okay. Finally, on this slide, what I wanted to illustrate is the alignment or the associations between these three basic language functions on the left, the status of an author, right, and certain types of genres. So for example, if we look at the expressive function, again, that's the use of language when we're trying to convey emotion, impression, or even authority. In this type of text, the author's intention is important. The author's status is crucial. We care who the author is. Oh, that poem is by Pablo Neruda, or that short story is by Edgar Allan Poe, okay? Or that talk is by Martin Luther King Jr. It's very important who the author is, and we care about their intention. We also care about their style. Okay, so these texts tend to be concentrated in domains. That's where you would find them in the real world, like art, literature, music, sometimes politics, okay? And examples of genres where you would expect the expressive language function to be dominant would be, again, literature, film, essays, personal letters, song lyrics, okay? The informative function, which is makes up a huge percentage of the types of text that translators translate, the emphasis is on the message, the informational content. The author's status often is irrelevant. We don't care who actually sat at their computer terminal in a cubicle and typed up this earnings release or this geography textbook. I'm sure that person cares, but we as translators, it's irrelevant really. It's a generic corporate author. The domains where we tend to find texts in which the informative language function is dominant: science, technology, business, media, education. And so examples of genre or text varieties would be things like textbooks, reports, financial documents, journalism, news articles, and things like that. Okay, and then finally, the vocative language function, or that persuasive function, where the aim is to influence the reader's behavior. The emphasis is on the response or reaction of the reader. Again, many times the status of the author is irrelevant, but not necessarily, because sometimes that authority of the author is important in persuading or getting the reader to react in a particular way. Domains: advertising, politics, religion, think of a sacred text, tourism. They're all trying to get the reader to respond or react in a specific way. So genres would be advertisements and commercials, propaganda, political documents, sacred texts such as scriptures, instructions. When you buy that toaster and it comes with an instruction, that's a vocative text. It's trying to tell the reader what to do. It's also an informative text. It's very rarely an expressive text, right? So again, this chart, keep it handy, right? It just shows how with certain genres, there's a correlation between that genre, that text type, and a particular language function. I think that's it for this lesson. Let me see. Yeah, that's it for this lesson. We're going to move on to the presentation about the translation log in the next video.